Let me say I'm delighted to be able to join you all this afternoon, and thank you very much for joining into the Derbyshire Wildlife Trust annual general meeting today. Yeah, as Joe said, I started in April this year. In fact, contractually, I started as Chief Executive of the Wildlife Trust on April the 1st, which should have been a bit of a clue that it was going to be an interesting first year, perhaps. And I came to the Wildlife Trust because I feel so passionately that we absolutely have to be addressing the ecological emergency. You know, for a long time over the last few decades, we've had a lot of attention on the climate emergency, and quite right too. We've got to do so much more to address that, but there hasn't been enough attention on the ecological emergency. And in fact, the fact that the two are intertwined, and we can't possibly hope to solve one without solving the other. And so I could not be more delighted and honoured to be in this position of Chief Exec of the Wildlife Trusts. As I've come in, of course, I've tried to spend as much time as I can really learning about this amazing federation. And as Joe said, much as I wish I could be travelling around the country, meeting people on the ground at the moment, obviously that's proved very possible these last few months. But I have now, nonetheless, learned some really astonishing statistics and things about the Wildlife Trusts. In case you don't know, it is a federation of 46 individual wildlife trusts, some covering individual counties, English counties like Derbyshire, of course, some covering groups of counties, some of the smaller counties. Then we have a collection of trusts in Wales, but also we have Scottish Wildlife Trust and Ulster Wildlife Trust. And of course, we can't forget the islands, the Isle of Man, Alderney, and the Isles of Scilly as well. Altogether, 46 wildlife trusts doing a fantastic job for nature, putting nature's in recovery exactly where they are based and close to where people live. But together, that is such a powerful federation, such a powerful movement. Together we have 850,000 supporters, which, to put in perspective, is twice the size of the largest political party in this country. 50,000 volunteers. By some estimates, in a normal year, we have more interactions with school children than any other British charity. But get this, this is the one I really like. We actually have more nature reserves across the wildlife trusts than McDonald's has restaurants in the UK. In fact, 1,000 more. Which is quite fun, isn't it? I like that comparison. But here's the thing. We also estimate that 60% of the British population live within a 3-mile walk or cycle of a wildlife trust nature reserve. And I think that really points to the USP, if you like, of the wildlife trusts. It is about us being locally rooted in a particular place, in a particular community. And my goodness, that has been so important this year, hasn't it? When people have felt that need to reach out, not just to nature, but to nature close to where they live, and to reach out try and get their daily dose of nature on a walk or cycle ride out from their house. And in fact, we've seen record numbers of people visiting our reserves this year right across the country. We saw a 2,000% increase in people looking at Wildlife Trust webcams during the first lockdown over the same months the year before. And we also saw record numbers of people getting involved in 30 Days Wild in June. Over 600,000 people across the country got involved in 30 Days Wild. So that's really exciting. But that's all really a foundation for what we have to do next as the Wildlife Trust movement. Because the fact is, I was saying before, we do face a climate and ecological emergency. So much as we could and should be really proud of everything the Wildlife Trust have done over the last century or so, actually we know it's not going to be enough. Actually, we're now in crisis mode for the planet, and we absolutely have to be big and bold and brave, as Joe was saying, to make sure we're addressing those twin emergencies of climate change and the loss of ecosystems. And let's just talk about just how serious they are. I mean, you'll know this, but it's always worth remembering it. With the climate crisis, the real concern there is that we're at these tipping points in the Earth system, which could mean we have positive feedback loops in the climate system. That means that climate change starts happening even faster than it is now, and that we get what's called runaway climate change. What do I mean by some of those feedback loops? Well, the fact that as the planet warms, for example, the Arctic ice in the northern latitudes is shrinking, and as that ice is replaced with dark seawater, actually that absorbs more of the sun's energy and means it warms up the northern latitudes even faster than before. And of course, where we're seeing the fastest warming on this planet at the moment is in the northern latitudes. Things like drying up of tropical rainforest, and the fact that when that happens, those rainforests like the Amazon at the moment, which are still just about places that are sucking carbon out the air, there's a real danger that as they dry up, they release more carbon. And that obviously points to that link between climate and ecology. And yet the fact is, much as nature is the best help we can have in tackling climate change, we've been eroding nature. Since 1970, we've lost around 68% of our wildlife populations. And it's worse for some categories of species, like our freshwater species, which have declined by 84%. Not surprising, perhaps, if you look at our wetlands globally, where we've lost 90% of them in the time that pretty much I've been alive. These are shocking statistics. And of course, we know that we have similar statistics here in the UK, where according to the State of Nature report produced by a whole big coalition of NGOs just last autumn, that was indicating that 41% of our wildlife species have declined in abundance, again, since the early 1970s. You know, what I find extraordinary about this, and throughout my career, what I've always found bizarre is how you will have some commentators that kind of hold up protecting nature or trying to take steps to protect the environment as some kind of barrier to progress. It's often kind of said, in fact, I've had people heckle me before now, say, when I was talking about the need for us to not build a road to a wildlife site and so on, I've had people kind of heckle me and say, yeah, but Craig, you can't stop progress. As if actually eroding nature and causing climate change is somehow a form of progress. I don't get that. I don't see how eroding our soils, losing soil fertility, destroying our pollinators, destroying our forests is a form of progress. And of course, we've had such a stark reminder of that this year, haven't we, with COVID? You know, 20 years ago, the UN Millennium Ecosystem Assessment warned that if we were going to keep eroding habitats, wildlife habitats around the world, particularly in the tropics, particularly tropical rainforest habitats, and if we were going to continue having an international trade in endangered species, that this was ultimately going to lead to ever more pandemics, as we saw exotic zoonotic diseases escape from the tropics and into humans. And of course, we've had a series of those as a result of that: Ebola, SARS, and so on. And then, of course, COVID this year, causing all the devastation, the human misery, and of course, the economic impact that's resulted from that. So I don't think at all, actually, trying to focus on putting nature into recovery, protecting the environment is a barrier to progress. I actually think it is the next step of human progress. If we can learn to live fairly within environmental limits, all 7, 8, 9 billion of us on this planet, surely that is the next step of human progress. And if it's not that, what is it? The scientists are pretty clear that if we don't learn to live fairly within environmental limits, actually there might not be another step in human progress. And so one of the things I want to invite you to think about today, as you're at the Derbyshire Wildlife Trust annual general meeting, is to recognise that you're part of a movement. As Derbyshire, trying to put nature into recovery in Derbyshire, as part of the Derbyshire Wildlife Trust, but you're part of the wider Wildlife Trust movement that's trying to do that across the UK. And we're also part of a global movement of people trying to make sure, not just that we're putting nature into recovery, but actually trying to make sure that our human civilization can reach that next step of human progress, learning to live fairly within environmental limits. So how do we need to do that? Well, as Joe was saying, as I was saying up top, first and foremost, we really have got to put nature into recovery. You know, we've seen those appalling declines over the last few decades, and particularly in the last 30, 40 years. It's not good enough for us just to talk about trying to slow those declines. We have to turn those around. We have to put nature into recovery. We have to have a vision of actually restoring the abundance of our wildlife populations back to where it was, not just in the 1970s, but back to it was in the 1900s, in the 1800s, and so on. And actually a vision that's as much as, not so much a nostalgic one, but one that is about how wildlife and people can live side by side, and actually how wildlife are integrated and restoring the connection between people and wildlife. So as the Wildlife Trusts this year, we've adopted a very clear goal, which I hope you heard about, that we want to see 30% of our land and sea in the UK being managed for nature's recovery by 2030. We knew that thinking was being developed in the Convention on Biological Diversity, and we know sooner or later the UK government might under be pressure to sign up to it. But we also thought there was a danger the government might not do it the way they should do if we didn't actually get behind it and try and make sure that it was being done properly. And sure enough, as it happened, when Boris Johnson signed up to the Leaders' Pledge in September, Downing Street said at the time that actually very happy to sign up to 30% of land and sea into nature's recovery by 2030, because he thought that we're already at 26% now. That is wrong, I have to tell you. The only way Downing Street could get to those figures was by including all our national parks and ANOBs as if they are being managed perfectly for wildlife. And we know, and you know, particularly I know in Derbyshire, and I know Joe and her team have done a lot of work on this. Actually, of course, our national parks and ANOBs are not primarily wildlife designations, not nature designations. They're designations for cultural landscape value. And therefore, actually, we sometimes see our wildlife in a worse state in our national parks than outside them. So one of the things we do need to see is national parks and ANOBs being managed more directly for wildlife benefit and for nature's recovery. But that won't be enough, because actually, even if you were able to imagine that to happen, the truth is right now, it's only around 10% of this country which is designated specifically for wildlife, our sites of special scientific interest. Half of those, according to Natural England, are in a poor condition. So rather than the 26% Boris Johnson indicated when he signed up to 30 by 30, actually we're closer to around 5%. The truth is we have to really make a lot more space for nature. And this is why the Wildlife Trust for many years now has been talking about this concept of living landscapes and living seas, why we were at the forefront of arguing for a nature recovery network. And we do have now the powers, the duty on government to introduce that through the new Environment Bill, which is going through Parliament right now. And it's very good that we're starting to see good thinking around things like the environmental land management schemes for changes to agricultural policy, and the new tree strategy, possibly, if those are done right, and that's a big if, those could help make more space for nature. But we still don't think it's there yet, nothing like, which is why also this year we launched our campaign for a new designation called Wild Belt, because at the moment, it's crazy, isn't it? But there is no designation in this country that actually allows you to take land that is currently of low biodiversity value, perhaps tired old agricultural land, and designate it to say this is going to be managed for nature's recovery. So we've proposed this new designation, Wild Belt. It's getting a lot of political support and attention, and we're actually confident we might win that at some point soon. And this fits in perfectly with all the work that Joe and her team are doing in Derbyshire to create a wilder Derbyshire, and particularly a wilder peak as well. What we think Wild Belt could do is really make sense of and add up all those bits of land that we need to be managing for nature's recovery. So yes, land that might change in management because of changes to agricultural policy and where you see rewilding on that land, land under the tree strategy where we want to see a much greater emphasis on natural regeneration of trees, designating particularly river zones, which will be so important for rewilding to protect us from floods and to protect pollution and soil getting into our rivers, but also all the hidden havens, particularly in and around our towns and cities, the scrappy, messy bits of our towns and cities, what some people might see as sort of the brownfield land or the bits on the urban fringe. Actually, these are incredibly important bits for wildlife, and they're the foundations from which a lot of nature can recover. And because they're close to where people live, actually they're incredibly important for people's physical and mental well-being. So at the moment we have greenbelt around some of our towns and cities. That's all good. At least it stopped some of the worst examples of development around our city fringes. But actually, wouldn't it be better to overlay that with wild belt so that we can very clearly put nature into recovery? And I love the idea that one day you'd almost like know you're reaching a town and city in Britain because actually the first thing you see is this buffer of nature around our towns and cities, and cutting right into the centre of our towns and cities as well. Again, putting nature into recovery, but also the relationship between people and nature. And at the Wildlife Trusts, with that vision for 30% of our land and sea being put into nature's recovery, we think that can happen at all levels. Yes, we'd like to see roughly 30% of each county being managed for nature's recovery. But why not 30% of your garden, 30% of your local park, 30% of the school grounds as well, or hospitals as well? We know that people recovering from operations in hospitals do so quicker, according to the science, if they can have a view of nature. So wouldn't it be nice if our hospitals actually looked a bit more like nature reserves and felt a bit more nature reserves, and then they'd be better hospitals in their own right? We've heard the phrase a lot this year about protect the NHS. Absolutely right. But you know what? If we had nature in recovery in this country, because of how that would improve people's physical and mental well-being, actually putting nature in recovery is also a very good way to protect the NHS. We mustn't forget about marine issues. I know with Derbyshire, you're a little distant from the sea, but actually around half of our biodiversity in the UK is thought to be in the marine environment. And it's absolutely essential that we see our marine environment being restored as well, not least because of the role that can play in helping tackle climate change. So we have to do all of this, and we have to do it at scale and at pace. You know, I've said a few times recently that if the UK was hosting the Olympics in 2030, what we'd expect government to do is have a very clear project plan about how to get there, with Gantt charts and milestones and very clear project plans about how to get there year on year to make sure we don't miss the deadline. That's what we now need, the equivalent of in tackling our climate, making sure we reach our climate targets, and also we reach that target to get 30% of land and sea into recovery by 2030. So that's the kind of detail we'll be pushing for at the Wildlife Trusts. Critical to this also, absolutely critical, is that we see a big uplift in people taking action for nature to deliver on this. Because putting nature into recovery is not something that needs to be done to people. Actually, it has to be done by people. The more that we can engage local communities, landowners, farmers, everyone, as many stakeholders as possible, in being part of this incredible project to put nature into recovery, the more it will last and endure, and the faster we'll be able to scale this up. So that's why our engagement that we do at the Wildlife Trust, whether it's 30 Days Wild or hundreds of different individual projects of Wildlife Trusts right across the country, why it's so important, so that everyone feels they can have a stake in putting nature into recovery. And one final thought I want to say is we mustn't forget as well that this is critically important in helping us tackle climate change. You know, at the Wildlife Trusts, we estimate that if we got really serious about this, if we were able to deliver recovery of nature at scale and pace in this country, guess what? There's a potential it could even draw carbon out the air equivalent to around a third of the UK's current carbon emissions. That is absolutely huge. This is the ultimate win-win-win-win-win-win. It's extraordinary. We've absolutely got to do it. And of course, a huge role for you in Derbyshire on this, with the plans for wilder peak and restoring peat bogs, and actually making sure peat bogs, rather than being a source of carbon emissions, as they often are now when they're degraded, that actually they end up sucking carbon out the air again. And my goodness, wouldn't it be embarrassing if roughly a year from now, when the UK hosts the next big UN climate conference in Glasgow, wouldn't it be embarrassing if the UK was still allowing burning of peat bogs just within a short distance of where that meeting will be held? We have to see the UK government banning the burning of peat bogs in this country. And I'd add, wouldn't it be nice also to finally see a ban on the sale of peat in our garden centres and retailers as well? If we can do all of this, then we can tackle the climate crisis, and we can tackle the ecological crisis, and do so together and in a way that makes life better for nature and for people. So that's what I'm saying. Never forget that through your membership of the Derbyshire Wildlife Trusts, through the involvement in those activities, through that fantastic programme to put nature in recovery in Derbyshire, you're doing all of those things. You will have a wilder Derbyshire as a result of it. But actually, you're also helping all of us right around the world work together to create that next step of human progress, which has to be billions of people learning to live fairly within environmental limits and rebuilding that connection between people and nature. Because by my estimate, there isn't another step of human progress available. That's the one we've got to focus on. Thank you very much.
Brilliant, really inspiring, Craig. Thank you for that. We have got a few questions that have been coming into the question and answer box. So if you're happy to answer them, I'll read them out so you don't have to worry about finding them on your screen. So we've got a question from Valerie Broom. She says, what do you think about the government post-Brexit proposals for the subsidy and regulatory framework for agriculture and the countryside?
Yeah, very good, timely question. Well, we've worked really hard, really, since the referendum in 2016, and in close coalition with other NGOs, environmental NGOs, to try and make sure that the new regime for agricultural policy in particular is doing the best job it can for putting nature into recovery. And we were at the forefront with, as I said, other NGOs in calling for the fundamental principle that where public money is to be used, for example, in subsidizing farmers, then that should only be used for helping provide public goods. So no longer will we have subsidies, taxpayer subsidies, to pay for something that actually the market can pay for anyway. In other words, basically food. Actually, the market pays for food. So what we do need is we need subsidies, taxpayer subsidies, to be used to pay farmers and other landowners to put nature into recovery, to allow tree planting, or even better, natural regeneration of trees, for example, on farms and so on. So we've basically won that principle. I would say the jury is still out on exactly how good the government policies will be on this. I mean, a lot of the rhetoric is very encouraging. I think a lot of the fundamentals approaching it are pretty good. But what's missing at the moment, sadly, is the real detail of this, so as to know how well it will deliver, and actually what the money will be spent on in different components of the policy. So it's quite a detailed thing to give a real detailed answer to, so I wouldn't want to go into it in too much. What I can say is actually we've had a series of webinars recently that have been open to the public called Wildlife. You can find them on YouTube. Wildlife Trust, Wildlife. The most recent one we did, which was just a couple of weeks ago, was on exactly this topic, and we had a fantastic panel which I chaired with some of agricultural experts from across the Wildlife Trust, Minette Batters, president of the NFU, farmers as well, and in fact the most senior civil servant in government that's at the forefront of shaping this agricultural policy. So if you want to know more about that, I'd encourage you to have a good look at that Wildlife. But short answer is it's certainly heading in the right direction. Hopefully the rhetoric is good, but detail is what's going to matter.
Brilliant. Okay, and sort of linked to this, but you might be able to expand just ever so slightly. We've got a question from Jane Sterland, who says, how is the Wildlife Trust perceived by the government decision makers? Are they listening to us?
Yeah, great question. Well, the first thing I'd say is there's no at any time, there's no such thing as just one government, actually. It's often sort of perceived as that there is the government. But you always have a very different reaction in different parts of government, different departments, different ministers, and so on will react differently. And but that's particularly true, I think, actually at the moment. Over the last year or so, that's been very much the case. We are certainly perceived quite well in big bits of government. They certainly don't ignore us, I don't think. And in my experience, the worst thing is to be ignored. You don't necessarily want people to always agree with you, but actually the worst thing is to be ignored, and they certainly don't ignore us. But the fact is over the last few years, a lot of the measures that we've been proposing for at the Wildlife Trust, both on agricultural policy I was just talking about, or indeed our idea for Wild Belt that we came up with this early this year, for our nature recovery network, for many other measures, particularly around marine as well. We have been successful in getting those through into government policy, perhaps not always exactly how we would deliver it if, say, we were government, but nonetheless, we have been successful in getting some real advances. But the problem is, what we can't be doing is doing that just within the environmental bits of government, just in DEFRA. And one of the things I think where we need to improve, not just us, but actually the whole environment sector, is actually to make sure that we are listened to more in Treasury, in the Department of Business, in planning and so on, and those kind of areas. And that's going to be a real focus for us over the next couple of years, is to make sure that we get heard even more in those bits of government.
Great, yeah, I agree. So something quite close to our hearts here in Derbyshire, we've had a question about national parks. So the question is, do the national parks need fundamentally repurposing to focus on delivering biodiversity?
I mean, I think yes is the short answer to that. We certainly feel like that at the Wildlife Trusts. I mean, look, we can have a big debate about this as a nation. The first thing we need to do is not pretend they're doing something they're not. National parks are not primarily wildlife designations. They are cultural landscape designations. And we can decide as a nation, maybe that's what we want, and we don't want them to be wildlife designations, or we can decide they also need to be there for putting nature in recovery. But now let's not pretend they're one thing when they're not. And I think often, I think in the past, there's almost been this kind of lazy assumption that our national parks are delivering for wildlife when that's not the case. But of course, we would say at the Wildlife Trust, we want to see national parks being used to put nature into recovery. That means we need to see a much greater focus on that by obviously the bodies that deliver those. But as much as anything, it's beyond just that. It's that government policy needs to give national park bodies and areas of outstanding natural beauty the powers, the duties, and critically the money to be able to do all of those things that we're talking about. So when we're certainly not pointing the finger at the bodies themselves in that, we're saying actually government needs to get serious about the role that national parks and areas of outstanding beauty could and should be playing to put nature in recovery.
And we've got time for one more, if that's okay, Craig. And I think I'm going to try and combine a few questions that are all kind of related to development, really. So Andrew's mentioned about HS2 and Paul's mentioned about housing estates. If you could just tell us a little bit about how you see that we manage development in a nature-friendly way.
Well, the frustrating thing about this is it can be done. We've shown at the Wildlife Trusts how you can build new housing developments in a way that can put nature into recovery. Right across the country, we've done that, where we've worked with house builders on new build housing and actually work with them to make sure that nature is protected. And sometimes it's land that was low quality agricultural land before, that was low biodiversity value, but actually if you integrate nature's recovery as part of the housing development, actually you can end up with an area that has houses on it, but actually is better for nature than what was there before. So that can be done. But very sadly, that's not the case very often, of course. We don't see that happening nearly enough, and we need to see really tight planning controls to make sure that it's not just a handful of cases where that happens, but every time there's new development, whether it's housing or industry or commercial, that actually it's used to put nature into recovery. And then there is another big issue around what we would in the jargon call out national major infrastructure projects, and HS2 is an example of those. And actually what I think is shocking at the moment is a lot of the way government approaches our major infrastructure projects is the mechanisms it has to sort of protect the environment at a smaller scale for smaller developments are then exempt when it comes to our major infrastructure projects. That causes a problem for developments like HS2, for big road developments, even for offshore wind, which at the Wildlife Trust we support in how it helps us tackle climate change. But we're seeing a lot of that being done badly without the kind of protection for marine biodiversity. So we absolutely need to see those measures being put in place to make sure when any development happens at all, it can be done in a way that aids nature's recovery. And what a missed opportunity to not do that. It's absolutely crazy. So that is another area we're going to be pushing quite firmly on over the next couple of years.
Brilliant. Craig, well, we've got lots more questions actually, but I think we're going to have to leave it there. It was really inspiring to hear from you. And I think hopefully, you know, in future years, you can come and meet us for real, and
I'd love to.
We can show you a little bit about what we do here in Derbyshire. And do feel very free to stay with us as we continue along this journey. And normally we'd give you a massive round of applause, but of course it's very hard to do that via Zoom, but I'm sure behind the scenes that's what everyone is doing. So thanks again.
Thank you. Good luck with the meeting.
Brilliant.
Thanks.
Bye, Craig. Okay, so now what we'd like to do is build on what Craig was saying, really, is what do we need to do as a Wildlife Trust for the next 5 years? So can you share the slides, please, Alex? Thank you. So it makes sense to start by reflecting a little bit on the last 5 years, and we're really proud of what we've achieved. We've doubled in size and we've substantially increased our influence and our impact. We're particularly proud to have been vocal in protecting our badgers and our hen harriers, and we're really excited to be reintroducing beavers and starting some brilliant rewilding projects. We're also delighted, though, to be working more and more with people. We know the importance of people, and we're delighted to be working with charities like YMCA and Women's Work on a new green social prescribing pilot to improve health and well-being. Next slide. But we are in the midst of a biodiversity crisis, a climate crisis, and business as usual is just not an option. Our wildlife continues to rapidly decline despite our best efforts. And there's a growing disconnect between people and nature. And of course, right now we're in the middle of another crisis, COVID-19. But COVID-19, although it's been hard and stressful and complicated, and all of us have suffered in many different ways, it has, though, encouraged more people than ever before to connect with nature. And we need to ensure that out of this crisis comes a new normal, one which better enables nature's recovery and which supports wider recovery for people and for the economy. Next slide. So this is our vision. It's bold, it's ambitious. We want to lead nature's recovery and ensure 33% of Derbyshire is managed with wildlife in mind. We want to be increasingly bold, brave and imaginative, but we know we can't do this by ourselves. We need to empower, support and learn from others more than we've ever done before. And we genuinely believe that everyone has a role to play in nature's recovery. So we'll be working closely with individuals, with communities, with local authorities, with businesses, with landowners, with organisations. We'll basically try and support everyone to play their part. And we'll develop new and innovative ways to enable everyone to notice and connect with wildlife where they live, and ensuring 1 million connections a year by 2030. And as more people connect with wildlife, we'll also build a growing movement of people who will collectively and collaboratively ensure a wilder Derbyshire and ensure that 1 in 4 people will act for wildlife. And we know that's the tipping point. Once 1 in 4 people act for wildlife, then mass change starts to happen. And of course, it's very important that we operate within integrity. So we will continue to reduce our own impact by reducing our own carbon footprint, and we will work harder than ever before to sequester carbon. Next slide. So what does that really look like? So we want to work in partnership to develop exciting landscape scale programs. We want to support landowners and farmers to do better for nature and deliver nature-based solutions. And we also want to use those initiatives to demonstrate the benefit of a nature-based economy. We will work with partners, communities, individuals and landowners to develop really exciting and embracing rewilding initiatives, and we'll develop and implement plans for the reintroduction of key species. Beavers already, but we also want pine martens, ospreys and much, much more. So we'll be bolder than ever before, and we will substantially increase our advocacy and influence. We'll build on our strong and growing reputation for wildlife, and we will ensure developments deliver genuine net gain for wildlife and that they support nature's recovery. Next slide. We want to make sure that everyone benefits from nature, and we strongly believe that the natural world should be an integral part of everybody's life. We'll therefore work more inclusively and collaboratively than ever before and ensure that everyone, everywhere, has the opportunity to connect with nature, thereby improving health, improving well-being, and encouraging more people to connect with nature so that they then start to notice and to care. Next slide. And most importantly, we want to increasingly mobilise individuals, communities and organisations to take action for nature. And we'll achieve this by working with others to develop a programme of support, of training, of toolkits and so much more. We want to ensure the level and the scale of wildlife activism substantially increases to deal with the emergency that we face. And as a result, we hopefully will create a huge, growing, connected, collaborative, wilder community, a community we will call Team Wilder. And that's our vision. We really want your views, your ideas, and we really need you to get involved. So please do let us know what you think in the chat. But before we perhaps take some questions, if we have time in a few minutes, we wanted to give you a taste of what our vision really looks like in reality. And so we're going to try and do some live Springwatch-like interactions with some of our sites and some of our teams. So, hello Sam, hello Dave.
Hello Joe, hi.
Hey, it's great to see you. Tell us where you are.
Well, I'm at our new nature reserve at Thornhill, which is, as you can see, beautiful view behind me. But I'm right at the top of the hill. It's a little bit breezy up here, so I hope you can hear me. Where are you, Sam?
Yeah, so not too far away from you, Dave, in one of the open grassland areas. But I also chose this spot so that I can show you the view across the valley. We get great views across the valley onto Bamford Edge.
Brilliant. So this is Thornhill Carr, one of our newest exciting nature reserves. But for those of you that don't really know anything about it, where is it and why have the Trust acquired it?
So Thornhill is up in the Upper Derwent Valley. You can probably just about see Ladybug in the background. And if I go around like this, there's Win Hill in the background there. Bamford's over there in the other direction. Our nature reserve at Ladybug Woods is just off of there in the distance above Ladybug. And we've had this site for about a year now. It was bought to us, for us really. We don't own it. An incredibly generous donor bought us this site so that we can really show how we want the Peak District to look. We want a wild peak. Over the next 5 years, we're going to be really pushing the Wild Peak programme, whereby we encourage landowners and we work with other organisations to make the Peak District a wilder place. And having Thornhill is going to allow us to show that, and is going to allow us to really explain to people in a real way how we can improve the land for wildlife by allowing nature to lead on how that happens.
Wow, that's really exciting. And Sam, tell us a little bit about the site. We can kind of see it, but if we were there with you, what would we see? What time of year is best to visit? And you know, what's the good wildlife spectacles that we might see if we come and visit further down the line?
Yeah, well, this is, fast becoming one of my favourite places to visit. Even on a cold winter's day in December, there's always something to see. So when I first arrived, there was a couple of bullfinches just busily picking off some berries off a hawthorn tree, which is a great little start. And one of the really special habitats of this site is the hawthorn scrub and the woodlands that we have here. And in the spring, they really transform the hillside. When all the blossom opens up, it just looks so amazing. And of course, the woodlands are really important for many of our birds here. We get all the sort of favourites, like the familiar birds like wrens and blackbirds and blue tits, grey tits, of course the chaffinch and the bullfinches, more elusive tree creepers perhaps also, and they're joined in the summer by a whole host of warblers as well when they come back from their migration. So it gets quite a busy site for the birds on here. We get birds of prey as well, so kestrels are quite often seen. And we're not too far away where a certain vulture was spotted for the summer this year as well. So yeah, but it's not just about the woodlands. We get these grasslands where we're stood as well. They really come into their own in the summer. And some of the grasslands are already quite rich in their biodiversity, full of flowers, things like field scabious, one of my favourites, Bethany, meadow vetchlins, which is so important for pollinators. Of course, we get many butterflies, and the bees and bugs and all sorts of stuff. A really important food source for other animals and mammals. So yeah, a lot going on. It's really packed in this site. We're not far from the river and the reservoir, as Dave sort of showed. So really up to you what time of year you come and visit, and the views as well. I don't think you'll be disappointed.
Brilliant. It's such an inspiring site and I can't wait to see it change over the next few years. And that's something we're going to be doing, monitoring the changes that happen as we allow the site to rewild. And it's so exciting, Dave. I'm sure everyone's thinking, how can I get involved? So how can people get involved in this site?
Well, you can see just in the background, we're very close to Bamford, and some of our friends from the local group in Bamford have offered to help us to monitor the site and record what they see. They're going to have some photography taking place here. But the only way that we're going to have a true recovered network, our nature recovery network, is only going to recover if people help and people kind of tell us what they see. If you've got a bit of land that you don't know what to do with, you can contact us and become part of our Wild Peak network. And look on our website. We're linked closely to Rewilding Britain, who kindly gave us some funding to be able to lead on rewilding in the Peak District. But, you know, any way that you can, something in your garden, something on your back doorstep, contact your counsellor, anything at all that you can do to help us expand the nature recovery network. Contact us, be part of it.
Brilliant. It's really exciting, and I hope people do get involved. Thanks, Sam. Thanks, Dave. I'm going to say goodbye to you, and we're going to mosey our way down to the south of the county. I was going to say zoom down the A6, but obviously we're reducing our carbon footprint, so instead we'll cycle. And we're down with you, George. Hi, George. How are you?
Hi, Joe. Great, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, really good. So, where are you? Tell us where you are.
So, I'm currently pretty much as central as I can get without being in the water at Wellington Wetlands Nature Reserve. The reserve is situated in the Trent Valley, so it's adjacent to the River Trent. It's pretty much between Burton and Nottingham.
Great, and it looks like a great day to visit, although pretty murky, but we can see quite a lot actually. But if we were all there on a real guided walk with you, and we spent, you know, half an hour or so on the site, what would we see?
So Wellington is made up of a mixture of habitats. So you can say it's a mosaic of habitats. We've got masses of open water, we've got reed beds, we've got areas of fen, wet woodland, dry woodland, wet grassland as well. So we get a real mixture of habitat and wildlife here. So just today alone, I've seen about 17 grey herons, plenty of cormorants flying over. We've got lapwing, which like to flock around the ponds, and they land in the meadows next to it. We have this morning as well, I spotted great spotted woodpecker, green woodpeckers, kingfishers also, they're a regular visitor here. So if you do nip down, have a sit on one of the platforms, give it 5 or 10 minutes, and I can pretty much guarantee that you'll see 1 or even 2 kingfishers here. But that's not all. A lot of people do like to focus on birds, which that's sort of their indicator of a good reserve is how many birds are here. But it's much more than that. We've got an array of wildlife here. We've got foxes, badgers, we've got water voles. We think we've got water vole, sorry. We've got lots of signs of water vole here. We have otters on the reserve, which is great to see, but also the fish numbers in the ponds is immense. So if you sit on platform 2, have a look out, you'll see the roach and rudd swimming around, and then you'll see them jumping out of the water as well, because we've got really big pike in here, and they like to hunt down the fish, and you see them jumping out. It's a great sight to see.
Brilliant. I mean, it's one of my favourite sites, and George and I were down there just the other day, and a kingfisher popped up right in front of us just as we were chatting, which was really cool. I know we've got lots of exciting plans for this site over the next few years. Can you tell us a little bit about them?
Yes, we've got quite a few. So hopefully by now everyone's heard of the Beaver Reintroduction Program at Wellington. We've been working on this for a number of years now. Lots of work's gone into it, but we're nearly there. So we're hoping for a release, a reintroduction of beavers on site in March. And part of this, we're going to have 2 families of beavers on reserve. And so a lot of people are questioning whether or not they can still come to the reserve once we have beavers. What's quite interesting about our release is that the fence line is going around the perimeter of the reserve, which will mean that you actually do get to go inside the beaver enclosure. Chances are you will get to see them at some point, but obviously they are nocturnal. They are quite skittish. They like to hide away. So we are expecting to see some activity in the next couple of years once we've released them. But not only this, we want to connect our reserve to the surrounding landscape. We want to work across sort of the whole landscape, not just reserves. We want the reserves to be like a hotspot for wildlife, which then floods out into the surrounding area. So what we want to do is connect our reserve up to the land next to us. So for part of this, we're going to do an access improvement project. So we're going to be improving the tracks along the reserve, put a bridge across the brook onto the surrounding land. So we've got Cemex next door, which is a massive quarry, and they've been restoring their land back to nature post-extraction. So we'll be able to go across our reserve onto Cemex, which is already teeming with wildlife too. So once we've done this, we'll have lots of access to the surrounding area. And we also want to improve the infrastructure on site. So better, bigger raised platforms and hides. Just want to make it as good for wildlife and for people as possible.
It's so amazing and really exciting. And it's going to change so much over the next few years. And oh my goodness, we're so excited about the beavers, and they'll be here in the spring. And you know, it's a family, so it's little baby beavers, which makes my heart very excited. And a bit like I asked the guys up at Thornhill, you know, how can people get involved in Wellington, George?
So we run volunteer work parties here. So until we get the beavers, we've got lots to do. So that's preparation for the beaver release. So our team of volunteers has been invaluable to us. They've been helping us clear the tracks, get the fence line ready. But we've also got a lot more reserves in the Trent, which need help on as well. So there's volunteering, there's supporting us through signing petitions, answering questions about how much we want beavers back in the area, but also yes, so we do a lot of, we're going to do a lot of research on the beaver project too. So we've got a really good team of volunteers that are putting camera traps out, monitoring footage, but we're going to be surveying all species on reserve, so from invertebrates in the stream to the big birds of prey, and also your larger mammals. So if you want to get involved with any of that, please do get in touch. We'd love to have you helping us out.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, George. It's so exciting.
Thank
and
you,
you know, George is a great member of staff, and it's a lot of fun down there. So, you know, if you have any spare time, get involved in Wellington. There's not much else you could do that would be more exciting. Brilliant. Thank you, George. We'll see you soon.
Cheers. Bye.
Okay, so hopefully that gives you a bit of a kind of flavour of the kind of projects and programmes that we want to run over the next few years. We have got a little bit of time for questions. So there's a few questions have come in, which I think are all very sensible. So I might just try and whiz through as many of them as possible in 5 minutes. So it's going to be like a bit of a short, sweet answer. So we've got one from Sue Bliss, who says, what's being done about the atrocious killing of wildlife on our grouse moors? And you know, we absolutely abhor the behaviour that goes on our grouse moors, and it's essential that grouse moors become better for wildlife. And you know, we regularly join in with Hen Harrier Day, and we are going to do more and more over the next 5 years to ensure that, as Craig was talking about, you know, it's ridiculous that we are burning our moors when we're in the middle of a climate crisis. So, you know, that kind of behaviour has to stop. So we'll be working to try and change our grouse moors and make them much better for wildlife over time. Martin Redmond's had a question about the Wild Peak project, which some of you might know about, which has been sort of going on for about 2 years. We're gradually building that programme. More and more people are getting on board. We're working with about 50 landowners now on kind of rewilding projects. And next year we're going to go big and brave and live with it. We wanted to make sure we had enough energy and momentum to start talking about that, you know, publicly and in the public domain. And we'll be ready to do that next spring, hopefully. Sue Bliss, will you be monitoring snares and traps? I mean, we probably don't have the capacity to monitor snares and traps as much as we would like to, but if anybody sees inappropriate behaviour anywhere, if they report it to us, then we can make sure something's done about it. Oh, I can't really read that one, it's quite complicated. And it's anonymous as well, so I might just skip that one. And the last one, Greg, is it plausible to work with garden centres to move, basically to get rid of peat being sold in our garden centres? And absolutely. And I think, you know, we are looking at a campaign probably next year. You'll have seen some of the stuff that Monty Don's done recently around peat. It goes back to what I was saying about burning peat. It's ridiculous to be burning peat. It's ridiculous to be selling peat. We should be restoring our moorland and you know, sequestering more carbon, and we will work harder than ever we have before to make sure that happens in the future. So thank you for your interest. Thank you for your questions. I'm sorry we haven't had a chance to answer absolutely everyone. We'll try and answer them by typing in an answer for those that we haven't managed to answer live. And I just wanted to thank you all really for your support. It's been a tough year for many of us, and particularly for the Trust, but we've come out of it robust and resilient, and that's because of you. It's because of our supporters, our partners, our trustee board, and most importantly, my amazing staff team. They've been brilliant this year. I mean, they're always brilliant, but they've been particularly brilliant this year during a very, very difficult and trying year. And for various different ways, they've all played their part in making sure that we've stayed in a place where we can continue to protect nature and ensure nature's recovery. We're going to have a short break now. We'll show a film during the break. Do take the opportunity to pop outside, see a little bit of wildlife, have a stretch, make a cup of tea. And we're going to start the more formal proceedings of the AGM at 3 o'clock. So we'll see you then. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.